Ever wondered why some people seem to have a gift for music? Have you ever wished that you could play by ear, sing in tune, improvise and jam? You're in the right place. Time to turn those wishes into reality. Welcome to the Musicality Podcast with your host, Christopher Sutton.
Have you ever felt frustrated or disappointed by the results you get from your music practice? Like you're just not making the progress you feel you should for the time and effort you're putting in? What if there was a way to get dramatically better results without spending dramatically more time? The answer is what has become the gold standard for how to acquire skills quickly: deliberate practice. Deliberate practice is a particular way of spending your practice time, which can be applied to almost any skill. It applies in fields as varied as medicine, sports, and, of course, music. It was developed by Professor Anders Ericsson, who we spoke with on our last episode, in collaboration with his research team over the years, and it has become a universally respected model for how we should think about getting the most from our practice time. There are a number of aspects to deliberate practice which we'll be talking about, but if I had to sum it up in a nutshell, it would be practice the hard things. Of course, by definition, that's going to require more effort from you, but this change alone can transform the results you get from your music practice. The biggest cause of wasted practice time is that we fall into the bad habit of letting practicing really just be playing. Meaning, we have our agenda of what we'll work on in each practice session, but those are actually just things you intend to play through, generally several times in a row. Unless you are in a lesson with a teacher, the chances are you play, you make mistakes, there's plenty of room for improvement, but then you just play the same thing again, or you move on to the next item. Playing is not practicing, and it's certainly not deliberate practice. There's a fantastic example of this given in Professor Ericsson's book, Peak. Once you reach a satisfactory level of driving ability, your skills don't typically improve beyond that, no matter how many years or decades you drive your car for. The average 20-something is going to make as many mistakes and have the same chances of being in an accident as the average 50-something will, even though one of them has spent 30 years more driving every day. The reason is that repetition by itself does not lead to improvement. So all those hours spent with your instrument in hand will not necessarily produce any improvement at all. That's why it's essential to really think about how you're spending that practice time and make sure that you're practicing, not just playing. So the quick description I like to give of deliberate practice is that you spend most of your time working on the things that you can't yet do, and a minimal amount of time doing the things that you can already do. So supposing you have a 2-minute piece you're working on. Typical practice habits would mean you play through the piece a few times. Deliberate practice looks more like you play through the piece, you notice a few sticking points where you aren't quite playing it correctly or fluidly enough, and then you spend a few minutes just practicing that first particular bar or two that was problematic, trying different approaches to fingering or phrasing, slowing it down, picking it apart, and really just drilling into that problem spot. Then, once you feel like you've found a solution or you've practiced to the point where it's become more fluid, you move on to the next problem spot. 90% of your time is spent on the 10% of the piece that causes you the most trouble. To pick another common example, often musicians will have a set of scales they're working on. Every practice session, they play through every scale. Often there are 1 or 2 tricky ones, but the rest are okay. And instead of playing all the scales equally each practice session, a musician who's using deliberate practice would instead spend all their scale practice time just on those 1 or 2 they know are causing them the most challenge. In fact, maybe just on the particular note or two, or the particular fingering combination in those scales that they know is the problem spot. I've been talking so far about instrument technique because this is traditionally how most musicians spend most of their practice time. Scales, exercises, and repertoire on the instrument. But this all applies fully to the inner skills and ear training we talk about so much here on the Musicality podcast too. For example, supposing you're learning to recognize different types of chord by ear. You've got the hang of major and minor chords, but you know you mix up augmented and diminished. The naive approach to practicing would be to continue to do exercises which feature all 4 types of triad, so that probably about half of the questions you do will feature major and minor chords. That means you're wasting half your time. Instead, you need to focus in on the chords which really trip you up. If you tend to confuse minor with diminished, spend your time practicing just those comparisons. This is a big part of why we always talk about the flexibility of our training system at Musical U, because you need that flexibility in which aspect of which topics you spend your time on, if you're going to maximize the results you get from your time and effort. So far, what I've been talking about is actually not quite deliberate practice. It's what's called purposeful practice, and it is a lot better than the standard, naive, purely repetitive practice approach. There are a few factors that set it apart. The first is that purposeful practice has well-defined, specific goals. Meaning, when you spend time working on a piece, there is a particular problem you're trying to solve, or a particular aspect of how you play it that you want to improve in a particular way. It's a provable thing, not just play this piece well, but something more like play this piece at full tempo without making any mistakes. Purposeful practice is also focused. Often during music practice, our minds will wander. Have you ever realized after a practice session that you've essentially autopiloted your way right through it? You've gone through the motions, but what you were doing wasn't even practice, let alone purposeful practice. So you need to stay focused. This makes it hard. Like I said at the start about this being about working on the hard things, focused practice is tiring, especially compared to the semi-brain-dead autopilot repetition style of so-called practicing you might be used to. You're going to be tired after a purposeful practice session, and that's a good thing. Purposeful practice also requires feedback. You need to be doing something where you can tell if you're getting it right or wrong, if you're improving or not. If you're doing, say, ear training exercises like we provide at Musical U, that's simple enough. You can do interactive quizzes and get clear, immediate feedback. When working on instrument technique, it can be less clear-cut. But if you feel like you don't have clear feedback on how your practice is going, that can be a good sign that you actually don't yet have specific, well-defined goals. And finally, purposeful practice means getting out of your comfort zone. You could construct well-defined specific goals, focus in on them, and get feedback, but do all that for a skill or activity that you can already do easily. So you should be selecting the targets for your purposeful practice to really push your ability. If you can currently play the first half of a piece but not the second half, it means not playing through the first half every time you try to play the second half, but just really spending your time on the part that you find hard. If you can already play a whole piece well, then it means trying to push a particular part from okay to excellent, or maybe moving your attention to another piece. This is a really common one, in fact, where a musician preparing, say, 3 pieces for an exam will divide their practice time equally across the 3, even if it's only one of them that they're really struggling with and need to improve. Or if you've mastered recognizing 1-4-5 chord progressions by ear, then it means moving on to songs which involve other types of chord too, rather than continuing to practice with more songs that are just 1-4-5s. If you've realized that rhythm is your weak point that holds you back from collaborating with other musicians, even though your rhythm seems good enough when you just play a piece by yourself, well, then it means working on tightening up your rhythm skills. Okay, so that's purposeful practice. We're going to set specific, well-defined goals that push us beyond our comfort zone, focus our attention on them during practice, and make sure we have clear, immediate feedback on how the practicing is going. Now, I said that this wasn't quite that gold standard of deliberate practice yet. So what's missing? What could we add to this which would transform it to be even more effective? Well, what we've laid out is clearly a recipe for making sure that the work you do by yourself on a skill you want to develop will be time and effort well spent. But in a lot of fields, including instrument technique and musicality training, there's actually a ton of knowledge out there about what you should be aiming for and how to get there. So instead of burying yourself away and trying to figure it all out through sheer force of effort, why not leverage all of that accumulated knowledge gained by others who've done it before? Deliberate practice builds on purposeful practice in 2 ways. The first is to recognize that for some fields, including music, there is a clear track record of individuals achieving expert performance, an objectively higher level of skill than others. You can compare your current skills with a clear target level you're trying to reach. And the second is that there are teachers available who can provide input that streamlines and accelerates the progress you make with your purposeful practice. Their input can let you shortcut the learning process compared with trying to figure it all out by yourself. For example, if you want to learn to recognize notes by ear so that you can play melodies on your instrument without needing sheet music, There is a brute force way to do this, where you just try and try and try again, lots of trial and error, making up your own examples. With purposeful practice, you will make some progress doing this. But what if instead you did a little research, discovered there was a method called solfa that provides a clear framework for learning this skill, that there are specific advantages it gives you, and there are clear steps for learning to use it? What if you sought out online training or an in-person teacher to help you learn solfa? Guess what? You're going to learn to play by ear in a fraction of the time it would have taken you to try to figure it all out by yourself, even if you were applying the principles of purposeful practice. So, deliberate practice is about leveraging what we as a culture already know about learning a particular skill efficiently, and it takes advantage of personal input and guidance. Clearly, this is why instrument learning has always primarily been done with in-person lessons with a teacher. I think a lot of us have forgotten that a bit in today's self-serve internet age, with all the tutorials and courses available instantly online. Those let you leverage society's knowledge, which is great, but you're missing that crucial personal input that can save you wasting time experimenting with a ton of different approaches to try and find a solution, by just providing you with the most relevant and effective, tried and tested solutions for any given problem you encounter. That's why we built unlimited personal support and guidance into Musical U, because we'd seen firsthand how even the best ear training resources kept failing students, because however purposeful their practice might be, it was just too much trial and error, and too much pressure on the student themselves to figure out how to get past sticking points. Things got so much simpler and more enjoyable for them once we brought all the training into an environment where we could give that personal support and guidance, answering questions, giving advice, helping them keep moving forwards. Have you ever gone through that yourself, where you're working hard on an app or a course, and then you hit a sticking point, and it just feels like you're banging your head against a wall for ages trying to get past it? Having personal input from an experienced teacher can help you leap every hurdle right away, instead of just stumbling around blindly in the dark. So those are the principles of purposeful practice and deliberate practice. Let's run through them again, and as I do, I'd like you to ask yourself which of them you're successfully using already in your music practice, and which you could usefully add to accelerate your progress. Purposeful practice means setting specific, well-defined goals, choosing goals and activities that push us beyond our comfort zone, focusing our attention on those goals during practice, and making sure we have clear, immediate feedback during practice. Deliberate practice has two additional characteristics. First, you take advantage of the existing knowledge about how the target skill is best learned. And second, you get specific personal guidance from a teacher who is experienced in helping people like you learn a skill like this. Now that we've talked through how the traditional, naive, blindly repetitive practice compares to purposeful practice and deliberate practice, I know you're going to see each practice session in a new light. You can go further with a short amount of time spent 100% focused on deliberate practice than you can with vastly more time spent unwisely doing autopilot playing that only mimics true practice. That means making a lot more progress from the same amount of time spent practicing. So if you've ever felt frustrated or disappointed by the progress you've made with your practice, take some of these ideas and start applying them for your instrument technique and your musicality training today.
Thank you for listening to the Musicality Podcast. This episode has ended, but your musical journey continues. Head over to musicalitypodcast.com, where you will find the links and resources mentioned in this episode, as well as bonus content exclusive for podcast listeners. That's musicalitypodcast.com.